Welcome back to Secret Speaks. How has your day been? Now let's uncover the mystery hidden in today's story. One sentence can split a life in two. When my daughter-in-law whispered, "Why is she even still alive?" and my own son laughed, I knew something inside me had shattered. My name is Evelyn Harper. I am 72 years old, and that insult forced me to reclaim my dignity. It pushed me to rewrite not only my will, but the story of my life. I carried the peach cobbler carefully in my hands, still warm from the oven, the scent of cinnamon and baked peaches rising into the cool air as I walked up the path to my son's backyard. The late afternoon sun was low, throwing long shadows across the grass. I slowed when I heard voices' laughter drifting over the fence. My heart tightened before I even reached the gate, a strange tension that made me pause. Then I heard Olivia's voice sharp and light at the same time. Why is she even still alive? The words struck like a slap. For a moment I couldn't breathe, and then Daniel's chuckle followed, low and complicit, not stopping her, not defending me. My legs felt rooted to the ground. I gripped the glass dish tighter, so tight I thought it might crack. My chest burned as if someone had opened it and poured ice inside. I could have turned around right then, gone home, and eaten the cobbler alone. But something heavier than pride pressed me forward. I pushed open the gate. The laughter stopped for a second when they noticed me, but no one rushed over to greet me. Olivia turned her face away, her smile frozen. Daniel muttered a quick hey, like I was a neighbor passing by, not his mother. The folding tables were decorated with paper plates and plastic cups, bright streamers hanging between the trees. A row of chairs lined one side, all filled except for a single one at the very end, farthest from the food and conversation. I carried the cobbler to the buffet table. No one moved to help. I set it down beside a store-bought cake Olivia must have picked up, and she immediately slid a stack of napkins in front of my dish, blocking it from view. My lips trembled, but I forced them into a thin smile. I walked toward the empty chair and sat my knees stiff, my hands folded in my lap. Ruby and Lucas sat a few chairs down, their eyes flicking toward me for only a moment before they turned away, whispering to their friends. The sting of it was worse than Olivia's words. Grandchildren who once climbed into my lap now acted as if I were invisible. The chatter at the table picked back up stories about work, about new vacations, Olivia's latest client. No one included me. I sat there nodding politely when my eyes were met mostly by strangers Daniel had invited. The cobbler remained untouched. They passed the cake 3 times before anyone even mentioned the dish I had made. When Daniel finally spoke, it was only to ask Olivia if there was enough ice in the cooler. I watched Olivia lean in her manicured nails, tapping the rim of her cup, her laughter carrying across the yard. She had built this perfect picture of family with me at the very edges, not part of it, but tolerated like a guest who had stayed too long. Every word she said seemed chosen to remind me of my place, every gesture cutting me out of the circle. I thought of Frank then, my husband, gone almost 10 years. He would have seen through Olivia's smile. He would have pulled up a chair beside me and made me feel safe. Instead, I sat alone, the air filled with the smell of grilled meat and citronella candles. My stomach knotted so tight I could not taste a thing. I folded my napkin and unfolded it again, the sound of the fabric crisp in my hands. No one noticed. No one cared. When Daniel raised his beer for a toast, his voice was loud, cheerful. "To family," he said, and glasses clinked together down the table. None of those glasses turned my way. I lifted my water cup halfway, then lowered it again. The loneliness in that moment felt heavier than the years I spent as a widow. At least then my absence mattered to someone. Here, my presence barely registered. When the plates were cleared, I rose and began gathering cups and paper plates, stacking them in a trash bag. I moved silently around the yard, the way I had cleaned classrooms after my students left, making order from chaos. Daniel walked past me twice without a word. Olivia called out to someone else about more wine. Ruby brushed by to grab a soda, her shoulder nearly touching mine, and she did not look at me. By the time the yard was tidied, the sun had dropped behind the trees and the air had cooled. My hands were sticky from spilled soda, and my back ached. I returned to the buffet table. The cobbler sat there barely touched, only one spoonful missing, probably taken by a child out of politeness. I covered it with foil and held it tight to my chest. No one said goodbye. No one asked me to stay a little longer. I walked out through the gate and down the path to my car. The cobbler felt heavier than when I had brought it. My steps were steady, though inside me a storm swirled. Each word of Olivia's echoed with Daniel's laugh behind it. Why is she even still alive? It repeated until my jaw clenched so hard I thought my teeth would crack. I opened the car door, set the dish on the seat beside me, and closed it gently. The quiet was thick around me. As I sat there, hands on the steering wheel, I looked back at the house lights glowing in the windows, voices carrying faintly through the walls. They were still laughing, still celebrating, as if I had never been there at all. My reflection in the rearview mirror was pale-lined but steady. A strange calm spread through me. Not the kind that comes with forgiveness, but the kind that comes with decision. For years I had told myself family was worth every sacrifice, but tonight proved what I had been too afraid to admit. Family that doesn't see you is no family at all. I turned the key in the ignition, the engine humming, and drove away into the darkening streets, leaving their laughter behind me. I did not cry. I did not rage. I only knew one thing with certainty. This would be the last time I allowed myself to be treated as if I were invisible. The morning light came through the curtains in thin gray lines, and for a while I just sat at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee cooling in my hands. The silence pressed around me thick and almost comforting, the kind of quiet that told me no one expected me to smile or make conversation. My eyes drifted to the filing cabinet by the wall, the one I had not opened in years. Inside were the papers that had shaped my life, the documents that carried the weight of every choice I had made for Daniel and his family. I set down the mug and pulled open the drawer. The metal groaned like it too was tired. Folders were stacked, neatly labeled in my handwriting from a decade ago. School loans, insurance policies, medical records. And then I saw it written in thick black marker across a manila folder, Daniel House. My stomach tightened as I pulled it free. I carried it back to the table and opened it slowly, as though I already knew it would hurt. Inside was the purchase agreement for the house Daniel and Olivia lived in now. My own signature scrawled on the letter that accompanied the check, $60,000 taken from my retirement account in 2011. I had written it out with careful strokes, ending with the words, "No need to repay, because you are my son, my blood." Reading those lines again was like driving a knife between my ribs. I remembered the way Daniel had hugged me when I handed him that check, the relief in his eyes, the gratitude he could barely put into words. Back then I thought it was proof of our bond, proof that he would always know where he came from, but now that same house was the place where Olivia mocked me and Daniel laughed with her, the place where my grandchildren could walk past me without a hello. The walls I had helped them build were the same walls that shut me out. I pressed my palm to the papers, wishing I could take the ink back, erase my generosity with a single swipe. Instead, the words stared back at me, permanent, undeniable. I leaned back in the chair, closing my eyes, and Frank's face came to me. He had been gone 10 years now, but I could still hear him in the way the floor creaked under my feet, in the smell of sawdust when I opened the garage. He used to dream out loud about the future, about Christmas mornings filled with grandchildren tearing wrapping paper, about long tables where everyone gathered loud and messy but together. He believed that family was a circle you could always step into no matter what. I used to believe that too. I stood and walked slowly through the house. My own home felt smaller than it once had. The pictures on the wall showed Daniel as a boy, Ruby and Lucas as babies. I touched the glass of one frame, tracing the outline of Ruby's little hand pressed against mine in a photograph from a summer fair. That child had clung to me once, giggling as I bought her cotton candy. Now she could not even meet my eyes. I went back to the table and stared at the folder again. The number haunted me. $60,000. It had been my cushion, my safety net, the money I was supposed to rely on when my body grew too tired to work. I gave it away so Daniel and Olivia could have their dream home, and what did I receive in return? Not even a seat at the table. Not even respect. I had bought myself a life on the margins of their family, a role so small it barely existed. I thought of the sacrifices Frank and I had made. Nights he took on extra shifts at the plant, weekends I graded papers until my eyes burned. All so we could have enough to leave something for Daniel. I had imagined we would use it wisely like that. Instead, I had funneled my future into walls that now stood as barriers against me. A dull ache spread through my chest. It was not just about the money. It was about the faith I had placed in Daniel, the belief that blood meant loyalty. That letter I had written was not just a financial gift. It was a promise, a vow that I would always be there for him. Now, staring at the brittle paper, I realized he had never written one back. I rose and carried the folder back to the cabinet, sliding it into place with shaking hands. The sound of it closing felt like a door slamming inside me. I poured myself another cup of coffee, the bitter smell filling the air. As I sat, I told myself the truth I had been avoiding. I had given up my financial security, my peace of mind, even my dignity in exchange for belonging. And still I was treated like an outsider. The clock ticked steadily on the wall each second, a reminder that time was slipping past. I thought about the years ahead, about the long days of aging alone, and wondered if all I had left was the role of an afterthought. My fingers tapped against the ceramic mug, restless. Frank had always said that regret was a poison, and I had tried to live without it. But regret had been growing inside me for years, and now it bloomed like a dark flower. Regret for the money I gave. Regret for the silence I kept. Regret for letting Daniel and Olivia shape me into someone grateful for scraps. I stood and walked to the window. Outside, the garden needed tending, weeds curling along the fence, the marigolds leaning. This house was mine, bought with years of work filled with my memories, and yet it felt less like home than the place I had paid for Daniel. The irony was sharp and cruel. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass and whispered to Frank, though I knew he could not hear me. I am sorry. I thought giving them everything would keep us close. I thought money could bind us. I was wrong. When I turned back to the room, the decision was already there, steady in my chest. I would no longer trade my future for their comfort. I would no longer sacrifice myself to prove my worth. They had shown me who I was to them, and now I would decide who they were to me. I gathered the dishes from the sink, washed them slowly, the warm water calming my hands. Each plate I dried and set aside felt like closing a chapter. When I finally sat down again, the house was quiet, my heart steadier. I did not know exactly what I would do next, but I knew one thing with clarity. The life I had built around them was over. It was time to build a life of my own. The next morning I dressed carefully, more carefully than I had in months. I ironed my slacks, buttoned a blouse that still smelled faintly of cedar from the closet, and put on the navy coat Frank used to say made me look dignified. It was too warm for a coat, but I wanted the armor. I wanted to walk into Lena's house with my back straight, not hunched like someone asking permission. Lena Moore lived 3 blocks over in a brick bungalow with wide steps and tidy hedges that always looked freshly clipped. I carried the folder under my arm, its edges digging into my side. The weight of it felt heavier than paper. When she opened the door, the smell of lemon cleaner and peppermint tea floated out. Her hair was shorter than I remembered, a sharp bob that matched her sharp eyes. She didn't waste words. "Come in, Evelyn. Let's see what you've brought." We sat at her kitchen table, sunlight falling across the stacks of legal pads and file folders that marked her as someone who never really retired. I slid the folder toward her. She opened it, pulled out the letter I had written Daniel the bank statement from 2011. She read quickly, her lips pressed in a thin line. After a few minutes, she gave a small grunt. "You can't take the house back. It's theirs now. You gifted it with no strings." I nodded, my throat tightening. I knew that answer already, but hearing it aloud carved it deeper. "But that doesn't mean you're powerless," she continued. "You can decide what happens with everything else. Your will, your power of attorney, your accounts. Right now, Daniel is set up to make decisions for you, isn't he?" I looked down at my hands, remembering the papers I had signed 3 years earlier after a fall in the bathroom scared me. "Yes." Lena tapped the folder. "Then it's time to change that. You cannot undo the past, but you can make sure the future belongs to you." She reached for a notepad and began writing. The pen scratched across the paper, each word neat and certain. When she was done, she slid it toward me. A checklist divided into boxes. Update will, revoke power of attorney, review bank accounts, remove authorized users, establish trust. "This is not just paperwork, Evelyn," she said. "This is how you reclaim your choices." I stared at the page. The words were simple, but together, they looked like a map out of a life I no longer wanted. "It feels like punishment," I admitted quietly. "Cutting him out." Lena leaned back, folding her hands. "Punishment is about them. This is about you. You've been living like a guest in your own story. That ends now." Her words settled over me like cool water. I thought of Daniel laughing in that backyard, Olivia's smile like a knife, my grandchildren walking past me as if I were transparent. Maybe I had been a guest all along, grateful for scraps. "What if they hate me?" I whispered. She gave me a look steady and unflinching. "Do you really think they love you now?" The silence after her question filled the kitchen. I could hear the ticking of her clock, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of her chair as she shifted. My answer was in my chest, heavy but undeniable. "No." "Then you have nothing to lose," she said. I picked up the checklist. The paper shook in my hands, not from weakness, but from the weight of a decision forming. I reached into my purse for a pen. At the top of the page, Lena had written Daniel's name beside the words, "Power of Attorney." I pressed the pen to the paper and drew a firm line through it. A simple gesture, but my chest expanded as if I had taken my first deep breath in years. "I am not sure who should take his place," I said. "That can come later," Lena replied. "For now, what matters is that he does not hold the key to your life." I folded the checklist carefully and slid it into my purse. The edges no longer felt like a burden. They felt like something solid, a shield instead of a chain. "Would you like me to handle the paperwork?" she asked. "Yes, please." She nodded, already pulling fresh forms from a drawer. Her movements were brisk, practiced. She had done this for others, women like me who had given too much and been left with too little. As she worked, I sipped the tea she poured. Peppermint, sharp and calming. I looked around her kitchen at the clean counters, the tidy shelves, everything in its place. I realized I wanted that for myself. Order, clarity, a life where my name was not hidden behind someone else's. When she finished, she stacked the forms neatly. "Come back tomorrow, Evelyn. We'll file the revocations. I'll notarize what I can here. Step by step, we'll set this right." I thanked her, my voice unsteady but stronger than when I had arrived. She walked me to the door, her hand firm on my shoulder. "You are not powerless. Remember that." Outside, the sun was brighter, the air sharper. I walked slowly down the steps, the purse heavy against my side, but in a new way. Not a burden, but a promise. Back at home, I sat again at the kitchen table. I laid the checklist flat, smoothing its edges with my palms. Daniel's name was crossed out, the ink still fresh. For years I had lived as if his approval defined me, as if his laughter or his silence decided my worth. Now, with a single line, I had begun rewriting my life. The clock ticked on steady and unbothered. I folded the paper and slipped it into the drawer beside me. Then I reached for a blank sheet of my own. At the top, I wrote Daniel's name. I stared at it for a long moment, the letters heavy with history, and then slowly, deliberately, I drew a line straight through it. The sound of the pen on paper was quiet, but in my chest it was thunder. That night I barely slept, but for once it was not from tossing in regret. I lay in bed with the faint hum of the ceiling fan above me, staring into the dark, listening to my own steady breath. By morning, my phone buzzed on the nightstand. A message glowed across the screen from Daniel. Mom Jody didn't mean anything. She was just tired. "You know how family things get. Please don't take it so hard." I read it twice, then a third time. My thumb hovered over the reply box. A dozen responses came to mind. Anger, hurt, demands for an apology. Instead, I pressed delete. The message vanished into nothing, and with it, the excuse I had been archiving in my chest for years. I would not be his museum of explanations anymore. I dressed simply slacks and a cardigan and walked to the library that afternoon. The building had always been a refuge for me. Rows of books had steadied me through grief and boredom alike. As I stepped through the glass doors, the smell of paper and dust wrapped around me. I felt calmer immediately. I was in the biography section when I spotted Ruby. Her hair was pulled into a messy bun, earbuds tucked into her ears. She moved quickly between aisles with two friends clutching a notebook against her chest. For a moment, my heart leapt, foolish hope flooding me. I waited for her to notice me. She did. Our eyes met for a split second, and then she looked past me, her gaze sliding like water over glass. She turned back to her friends, whispering something that made them laugh. My throat closed. I stood there frozen, holding a book I could not see while Ruby walked away, her sneakers squeaking faintly on the polished floor. I left without checking anything out. The sunlight outside felt harsher than when I had entered. My reflection in the glass doors showed someone pale and small, a woman who had once been the center of a family and now was nothing but a shadow in public spaces. 2 days later at the market, I turned the corner into the produce aisle. Olivia was there, her cart already full, a bottle of wine resting against the lettuce. She saw me. I know she did. Her back stiffened, and then she turned sharply toward the bakery section, as though the sight of me might stain her. I stood for a moment, my hand hovering above the apples. The chatter of other shoppers went on as usual, but inside me the world seemed to tilt. I thought I had grown used to rejection. But seeing her claim the space so easily, walking away like I was nothing more than an inconvenience, cut deeper than I expected. I forced myself to pick out the fruit one by one, though my fingers trembled. At the checkout, she was 2 lanes over. She laughed at something the cashier said, her head tipped back. She looked like a woman who had everything. By the time I got home, I was shaking. I set the groceries on the counter and gripped the edge until my knuckles whitened. I had not just lost my family. It seemed I was losing the places around them too. The library, the grocery store, the corners where our lives had once overlapped with ease. The final blow came a week later. I was walking back from the post office when I saw Marjorie, my neighbor of 20 years. We had once shared coffee on our porches, swapped recipes, even watched each other's children in emergencies. She was trimming her roses when I waved. "Hello, Marjorie." She looked up, squinting in the sun. For a moment I thought she would smile. Instead, she tilted her head and said in a voice almost identical to Olivia's, "Why is she still alive anyway?" The world tilted again. The hedge trimmer buzzed in her hand, drowning out the blood rushing in my ears. I could not speak. My lips parted, but no words came. I stood rooted to the sidewalk, staring at a woman who once knew the color of my kitchen walls, who once held Daniel when he scraped his knee. Marjorie turned back to her roses, as if she had simply made an observation about the weather. I kept walking, my legs wooden, my chest hollow. By the time I reached my porch, tears threatened, but I swallowed them back. Crying would give her words power. Crying would give all of them power. I sat on the steps and looked out at the quiet street, the same street where children used to ride bikes and call me Miss Evelyn when they wanted popsicles. Now it felt empty, hostile, as though the whole neighborhood had silently agreed to echo Olivia's judgment. The realization hit hard. It was not just my son's house that had turned against me. It was the world I had built around it. My community, my circle had shifted, and I had been pushed to the outside. The sun was setting, the sky streaked orange and pink, but I felt no warmth. My hands rested on my knees, steady at last. I had lost family, and now I was losing community. But somewhere in that loss, a strange certainty settled in. If they could all turn their backs so easily, then perhaps they had never truly seen me at all. I stayed on the porch until the last light drained from the sky, the neighborhood sinking into quiet, my heart heavy but resolved. The morning air was damp with the smell of rain, but I dressed and drove to First Community Credit Union anyway. The building stood squat and ordinary at the end of Main Street, but to me, it looked like a fortress. Inside, the hum of printers and the quiet shuffle of paper made me feel both small and ready. I asked for a manager, my voice steady, though my palms were damp. A woman named Trina Johnson appeared, brisk but kind, with glasses that caught the overhead lights. She led me into her glass-walled office, offered me water, and waited while I set my purse on the table. "I would like to review all authorized users on my accounts," I said. She typed quickly, her eyes scanning the screen. After a moment, she looked up. "You have 1 co-signer and 1 authorized cardholder listed. Daniel Harper. That's your son." Used to be, I said, before I could stop myself. Her hands hovered above the keyboard. Would you like to remove him? I would like to erase him, I answered. Completely. She nodded slowly, not unkindly. We can remove his access, cancel the card, reissue everything in your name only. We will need to reset your security questions and update your online login. Do it, I said. As she worked her fingers, pausing only to confirm a detail, I stared at the plant on her desk, a pothos, with glossy heart-shaped leaves trailing toward the floor. I remembered when Daniel was 3 tugging on one of my houseplants until the pot tipped and soil scattered across the carpet. I had laughed then, sweeping him into my arms, tickling him until his giggles filled the room. The memory stabbed like glass. Trina printed a stack of papers and slid them toward me. As I signed my pen, scratching across each line, she hesitated. There is something else, she said carefully. I need to make you aware of it. She turned her monitor slightly so I could see. A second account number glowed on the screen, one I did not recognize. It listed my name, my social security number, but I had never opened it. The balance was low, nearly drained. Next to the account was Daniel's name. What is that? I asked, my voice thin. It appears a loan was taken out under your name as primary with him as co-signer. She tapped the screen. The application dates back 2 years. The office spun around me. I gripped the edge of the desk, the world narrowing to the glowing numbers. He had used my name, my credit, without a word to me. Are you certain? I whispered. Yes, she said. The paperwork is clear. I sank back into the chair. Betrayal has a sound. It is not loud. It is the quiet rustle of papers that prove your child has sold your trust for cash. I felt my chest tighten, not with anger at first, but with grief so deep it hollowed me. Trina leaned forward, her voice gentle. You can file a fraud report if you want. We can flag the account, block future activity, and start the process of protecting your credit. But I need your consent. I nodded slowly. Yes. Do whatever you must. She gave me the forms. My hands shook as I filled them out. Each signature felt like cutting a cord, snipping thread after thread that had once bound us. When I finished, I pushed the papers toward her. No one else, I said firmly. From this moment, no one has access but me. Trina nodded and collected the papers. You are doing the right thing, she said. The right thing. The words echoed oddly inside me. Once I would have thought the right thing was forgiveness, silence was keeping the family circle whole at any cost. But that cost had become unbearable. I stood tucking my purse under my arm. My legs felt weak but steady. As I walked out through the lobby, I noticed an older couple at the counter, the man holding his wife's elbow gently while she signed a form. For a moment, envy pricked me sharp and sudden. Then I breathed out and reminded myself I had chosen this. I had chosen to save myself. Outside, the rain had stopped. The pavement gleamed wet under a thin layer of sunlight. I walked to my car slowly, each step deliberate. The betrayal weighed heavy, but beneath it a strange lightness stirred. There would be no more blind forgiveness, no more doors left unlocked for Daniel to slip through. I started the car and sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, staring at the bank's brick facade. My future no longer belonged to him. It belonged to me, and I intended to keep it that way. That evening, the sky turned a dull gray, heavy with clouds, and the air inside my house seemed just as weighted. I made myself a cup of tea, but let it sit untouched, cooling on the table while I stared at the faint rings left by years of other mugs. My purse still lay by the chair where I had dropped it after returning from the credit union, the signed forms inside like silent witnesses to the decision I had made. I had cut Daniel out of my finances, erased his name from everything that mattered, but the ache in my chest told me the wound ran deeper than any paper could heal. I rose slowly and walked to the hall closet. On the top shelf sat a wooden box I had not opened in nearly a decade. Frank had built it himself back when his hands were still strong, back when the smell of sawdust clung to his clothes every evening. He carved a small F+E on the underside of the lid, a private gesture only I knew about. For years I had kept the box hidden, afraid that opening it would unleash grief too raw to manage. But tonight, I needed him. I needed to remember the sound of his voice, the certainty with which he believed in me. I carried the box to the kitchen table and sat down. The hinges gave a small squeak as I lifted the lid. Inside were the tools of his life. His carpenter's hammer, its handle worn smooth by years of use, the metal head dulled from striking nails into countless beams. A pocket knife with a chipped handle, a tape measure marked with his notes in faded ink. I ran my fingers over each item slowly, as though touching them might bring his hands back to mine. At the bottom lay a single envelope. My name, Evelyn, was written in his familiar script. The edges were yellowed, the folds softened by time. My hands shook as I lifted it free. I had known this letter was here left for me when his health began to fail in 2014, but I had only read it once, unable to face it again until now. I unfolded the paper carefully, smoothing the creases flat on the table. His words looked back at me. If something happens to me, don't fold in. Stay open. Don't let anyone take away your right to decide for yourself. You are stronger than you know. I pressed the page to my chest and closed my eyes. For a moment, the years rolled back. I saw Frank in the half-finished house we built together, crouched on the floor fitting pieces of tile while sweat dripped from his forehead. I heard his laugh on a summer evening when Daniel, barely 5, came running across the yard with a frog cupped in his tiny hands, shouting to show us his discovery. I remembered the county fair, Daniel riding on Frank's shoulders, his sticky fingers gripping Frank's hair while fireworks lit up the night sky. Back then, I believed we were building something that would last forever. A home, a family, a legacy of love. Frank always said that our strength was not in money or possessions, but in the choices we made, the way we stood by each other. He would look at me and say, "Evelyn, you're tougher than you think. Promise me you'll never let anyone tell you otherwise." Tears slipped down my cheeks as I looked again at the words he had left. Don't let anyone take away your right to decide. How many times had I ignored that promise, silenced myself to keep the peace bent until I no longer recognized the shape of my own spine? Every time I let Daniel dismiss me, every time I accepted Olivia's cold smile, I had betrayed that promise to Frank. I set the letter down and reached for the hammer. The weight of it filled my palm, heavy and grounding. This was the tool Frank used to build our home, to shape the walls that sheltered us, to create something solid where there had once been only plans. Holding it, I felt him near, as though his hand guided mine. The house around me was quiet, but in my mind it came alive with memory. Frank whistling off-key while he painted the porch railing. The slam of Daniel's sneakers on the stairs when he was a teenager rushing out the door. My own laughter as I burned the first pie I ever baked in this kitchen, and Frank teasing me that it was extra crispy. Those sounds had filled the air once. Now only silence remained. I brushed the hammer's handle with my thumb and whispered into the stillness, "I should have listened to you. I should have remembered. But this time, Frank, I will keep your words." The clock in the hallway ticked past midnight. I sat at the table, the hammer before me, the letter folded neatly beside it. For the first time in years, the silence did not suffocate me. It steadied me. I could almost feel Frank's presence across the table, his patient gaze reminding me that strength was not in what you gave away, but in what you refused to surrender. I thought of Daniel again, the little boy who once traced letters on the fogged window of the car while Frank drove us home from church. The boy who used to curl against me when thunderstorms rattled the windows. That boy was long gone. The man he became had chosen to use my name for loans to laugh when his wife asked why I was still alive to let me sit at the edge of his life, as if I were a stranger. I folded the letter once more and placed it back in the box. The hammer I left on the table. Its weight belonged in sight, not hidden away. As I turned off the lamp and prepared to go upstairs, I paused in the doorway. The words I had spoken rose again in my chest, steady and certain. This time I will hold the line. This time I will not break the promise. I whispered into the empty room, my voice barely more than a breath. This time, Frank, I will keep it. And for the first time in a long while, I believed myself. The morning after I opened Frank's box, I called the number Lena had given me. A man named Charles Lindell answered, his voice calm and low, the kind of voice that did not rush. I told him I needed to speak about my estate, my will, and my property. He gave me an appointment for Thursday afternoon. By the time the day came, I had gathered everything into neat folders. Deed to the house, tax records, insurance policies, even receipts for the furnace I had paid for when Daniel said it was not worth the money. I wanted every thread of my history laid out, so there would be no confusion, no room for someone else to tell my story for me. His office was on the second floor of a red brick building downtown. The waiting room smelled faintly of coffee and lemon polish. When his assistant called my name, I walked in with my head high, though inside my chest my heart knocked hard. Charles was a man in his 50s, with silver hair at his temples and steady blue eyes. He shook my hand firmly, not the limp politeness I had grown used to, but like I was someone whose presence mattered. "Please sit," he said, and I did. I slid the folders across the table. This is everything I told him. I want to make sure Daniel Harper has no control, no claim, no inheritance. Not now, not ever. He listened without interruption, leafing through the documents with careful attention. When he finished, he nodded once. "We can do that." My throat loosened a little at those words. He explained patiently line by line. A new will. A revocation of the existing power of attorney. A living trust with me as the trustee and beneficiary while I lived. Upon my death, the house would be sold and every dollar would go to Greenway Women's Shelter. He glanced at me when I mentioned the shelter, perhaps surprised by the certainty in my voice. I stayed there once I told him quietly before Daniel was born. They gave me safety when no one else did. He did not ask more, only wrote it down with a small nod of respect. We spent nearly 2 hours reviewing details. He asked who I wanted as executor, if not Daniel. I told him I wanted a professional, someone who would see me as a client, not a burden. He made notes and offered names. He asked about accounts beneficiaries, small items of sentimental value. Each answer I gave felt like pulling my voice back into my own throat, one word at a time. When everything was prepared, he slid the pages toward me. At the top in bold letters it read, "New Will." I picked up the pen. For years my hands had trembled when I signed anything important, afraid of mistakes, afraid of doing the wrong thing. But as I bent over the paper, my fingers were steady. I wrote my name in long strokes, deliberate and sure. For a moment I just stared at the signature dark against the white page. It was mine, entirely mine, without anyone else's shadow on it. Charles gathered the documents, notarized what needed notarizing, and stacked them neatly into a binder. "This is your packet," he said. "Keep it safe. Everything else we will file." I held the binder close as if it were something alive. My chest rose and fell steady at last. "Thank you," I whispered. He smiled gently. "You did this, Evelyn." When I left the office, the sunlight was sharp, cutting across the street. I walked slower than usual, not because I was tired, but because I wanted to feel the ground solid beneath my feet. Each step carried the weight of a decision I had put off for too long. Back at home, I set the binder on the kitchen table. I made tea and sat with it in front of me. I opened to the first page, touched the ink of my own name, and let the truth settle in. For the first time in my life, I had written something not for Daniel, not for Olivia, not for appearances or obligation. This was for me. The room was quiet, the clock ticking in the hallway, the kettle cooling on the stove. I let out a slow breath and whispered into the still air. This is the first time I have ever written for myself. The morning sun poured across the kitchen table where the binder lay, its clean pages still carrying the smell of fresh ink. I had left it there overnight, unable to put it away, as if I needed to see it, to remind myself that it was real. I poured coffee into my favorite mug, the one with a small chip along the rim, and sat staring at the bold words on the cover. New will. For once, the weight pressing on my chest felt lighter. I was still holding the mug when a sharp knock broke the quiet. 3 hard raps, too urgent to ignore. My stomach tightened. I set the cup down and walked to the front door. When I opened it, Olivia stood there, her expression arranged into something between sympathy and control. Her coat was buttoned neatly, a scarf tucked just so, her lipstick precise. She looked like a woman who came to deliver judgment rather than comfort. "Evelyn," she said, her voice syrupy. "We've been hearing things. Daniel is worried sick. We are all worried about you." I stepped back a fraction, though my body remained between her and the living room. "You've never worried about me before," I said evenly. Her smile quivered but held. "We've always cared," she insisted. "That's why I'm here. People are talking. They're saying you're making strange changes, altering your finances, rewriting things you don't understand. I just don't want you to make mistakes you'll regret." I studied her face. Her eyes flicked past me into the room, landing on the binder sitting openly on the coffee table. I saw the way her gaze sharpened the quick calculation in the curve of her mouth. She had come for confirmation. I moved aside enough to let her in. She walked with quick clipped steps, pausing to glance at the photographs on the wall, pictures of Daniel as a boy of Frank, with his arms slung around me, of Ruby and Lucas as toddlers grinning with ice cream cones. She smiled at none of them. She stopped near the coffee table. Her eyes lingered on the binder. She turned back to me with a mask of concern. "Evelyn, we just want to help you. You know you can't manage everything on your own. What if you fall? What if you get sick? Who will be there for you?" Her tone was soft, persuasive, but underneath it pulsed an edge. "Better to be alone," I said, "than surrounded by people who treat me like a burden." Her lips tightened. "You're being ungrateful. We've always included you, even when it wasn't easy." I shook my head slowly. "No, Olivia. You never included me. You tolerated me. That is not the same." Her voice rose, then the sweetness dropping away. "Do you realize what you've done? You've embarrassed Daniel. You've upset the children. This family is falling apart because of you." I felt no tremor in my hands. My voice came calm and clear. "This family fell apart long before I changed anything. You made sure of that when you laughed at me behind fences and told others I wasn't worth acknowledging." Her eyes flashed, her control slipping. "You've ruined everything. Daniel works himself to the bone to hold this family together, and you've undermined him. You've made him look weak." I almost laughed at the absurdity. I never asked him to hold me together. I only asked to be treated like I mattered. That was too much for you. She stepped closer, her perfume sharp in the air. "You've destroyed your own legacy. Do you really think anyone will stand by you now?" I lifted my chin. "I don't need anyone who stands only when it's convenient." Her mouth opened, but nothing came. The silence stretched between us, thick as stone. Finally, she snapped her purse shut, the clasp loud in the stillness. "You will regret this," she hissed. I walked to the front door and opened it wide. The chill air swept in. Without another word, I held the door until she stepped through. Her heels clicked sharply against the porch boards. I followed her out, pulling the door closed behind her. I turned the lock slowly, the click echoing down the hall like a final verdict. For a long moment, I leaned my forehead against the door. My heart was steady, not racing. My breathing even. Outside, I could hear Olivia's car start, her engine revving as she pulled away, but inside the house there was only quiet. I turned and looked around the living room, the binder still on the table, the photos still on the wall. Nothing had changed yet. Everything felt different. The lock between us was not just wood and metal. It was my choice, my boundary solid and unshakable. I whispered into the silence, the words tasting true at last. Family is not only blood. The house seemed to hold its breath with me, and for the first time in years I felt like its walls were mine again. The night after Olivia left the house seemed to settle into a new kind of silence, one that did not sting, but felt protective. I slept deeper than I had in months. The next afternoon, while I was folding laundry in the living room, a soft knock came at the door. It was not the sharp demand of Olivia or Daniel, but a hesitant rhythm almost shy. When I opened the door, Ruby stood there. Her eyes were red, her cheeks blotched, her school backpack slung awkwardly over one shoulder. She looked smaller than I remembered, though she had grown taller in the past year. "Hi, Grandma," she whispered, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid someone might be watching. I stepped aside without warning. She walked in her shoes, squeaking faintly against the hardwood floor. She dropped the backpack onto the rug and stood twisting the strap in her hands, her eyes darting around the room like a bird unsure where to land. I waited. Silence stretched, broken only by the ticking of the clock. Finally, she blurted, "I saw you at the library." I pretended not to. I nodded once. Her voice cracked. "I didn't want to. Mom was there. She told me not to talk to you. She said you were trying to hurt us." I felt the words settle heavy but expected. I kept folding the towel in my hands, smoothing the edges, giving her space. "I'm sorry," Ruby whispered. "I wanted to say hi. I wanted to." I set the towel aside and looked at her fully. "Do you really want to be here now?" She blinked hard, then nodded, quick and certain. "Yes." The sound of it loosened something in my chest. She reached into her backpack and pulled out a folded piece of paper, edges frayed, as though she had hidden it for days. She handed it to me with both hands. I opened it carefully. The drawing showed a chessboard sketched in pencil. Most of the pieces were gone, only 2 left on one side, but still the smaller set had won. At the center of the picture sat a woman with gray hair, pulled back, her hand resting on a pawn. "It's you," Ruby said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Even when it looks like you're losing, you still win." My throat tightened. I held the drawing against my chest, the paper trembling against my heart. For weeks I had believed the cord between us was cut, that Olivia's coldness had burned through it. But here was proof in pencil and paper that the thread remained. I reached out and brushed a strand of hair from Ruby's face. She leaned into my hand for the briefest moment before pulling back, her eyes wet. "I don't want to lose you, Grandma." I pulled her close, then my arms around her slight shoulders. She clung to me with a fierceness that belied her age. In that embrace, the noise of Daniel's silence, Olivia's venom, the community's whispers, all of it fell away. There was only Ruby and me, bound by something deeper than blood, something neither of them could erase. When we finally let go, she wiped her face quickly with her sleeve. "I can't stay long. Mom thinks I'm at study group." I nodded. "Then just remember this. My door is always open to you, no matter what she says." Ruby gave me a small, shaky smile. She slipped the straps of her backpack over her shoulders again, the weight almost tipping her forward. At the door, she turned back once, eyes wide and earnest. "Promise me you won't give up." I lifted the drawing in my hand. "This is my promise." She left then, hurrying down the porch steps, glancing around as if shadows might carry tales back to her mother. I stood in the doorway until she disappeared around the corner, the late afternoon sun catching on her hair. When I closed the door, the drawing still pressed to my chest, I felt something I had not felt in a long time. Not just resolve, but connection. The line between us was not broken. It had only been hidden, waiting for the right moment to shine again. I pinned the drawing to the refrigerator with a magnet shaped like a star. The pencil lines looked fragile, but to me, they were stronger than steel. The next morning, I woke earlier than usual, the drawing Ruby had given me still resting on the nightstand. I studied the pencil strokes in the quiet dawn light and thought of how her young hands had shaped that image of resilience, 2 pieces left, yet still winning the game. It felt like a prophecy. I folded the paper carefully and slipped it inside the binder with my new will. Right beside it, I placed an envelope holding the check I had written the night before. My name was bold across it, the numbers firm. Driving across town, I felt an odd calm. The streets looked the same as always, shops opening, buses rumbling past, people wrapped in their morning routines. But inside me, something had shifted. I was not going to beg for a place at anyone's table anymore. I was going to build one for others. The Greenway Women's Shelter stood in a row of brick buildings, sturdy but unadorned. A mural of flowers covered one side wall, painted by local volunteers. The front entrance was simple, the glass door smudged with fingerprints of children who had pressed their faces against it. I pulled it open and stepped into a wave of warmth and faint smells of soup and laundry detergent. A little boy in mismatched pajamas ran past, clutching a toy car. Behind him, a young woman held a baby against her shoulder, eyes red from crying. She gave me a tired nod. Another sat on a bench by the window with a single plastic bag at her feet, everything she had in the world stuffed inside. For a moment, I was thrown back to 1981, standing in that same spot with Daniel in my arms, terrified and broke. My chest tightened at the memory, but I stood straighter. A woman in her 50s with kind eyes and gray streaks through dark hair approached me. She extended her hand firmly. "Mrs. Harper, I'm Karen Brooks, the director here. Thank you for coming." I shook her hand. "Please call me Evelyn." She led me into her office, modest and cluttered with stacks of paperwork, a cork board filled with schedules and children's drawings taped along the walls. On the desk sat a chipped mug that read, "World's Best Boss" in faded letters. I set the envelope in front of her and slid it across the desk. "This is for the shelter," I said. "When I pass, my house will be sold and everything will come here. This check is the beginning." Her hands trembled as she pulled the paper free. Her eyes widened at the number and she covered her mouth with her hand. "Evelyn, this will keep us open through winter. It means beds for women we would otherwise turn away." I felt heat rise behind my eyes, but I didn't cry. I know what it feels like to stand on your last dollar to wonder if anyone sees you. This place saved me once. I need it to keep saving others. She reached across the desk and clasped my hand tightly. "You have no idea what this means." I squeezed her fingers. "I do. More than you think." Karen offered to show me around, and I followed her down narrow hallways painted a hopeful yellow. We peeked into dorm-style rooms with bunk beds lined up neatly, each with quilts handmade by volunteers. A few mothers sat cross-legged on the beds, talking softly while children played nearby. In the common room, toddlers sat on a rug surrounded by toys, their small voices rising in bursts of laughter. One woman caught my gaze. A bruise spread along her cheekbone, and her child no more than 4 clung to her leg. Our eyes locked for a second. I saw fear there, but also something familiar, a spark of survival. I gave her the faintest nod. She returned it, and in that instant, it felt like I was looking at my younger self reflected back. Back in her office, Karen wiped her eyes with a tissue. "You've done something extraordinary today." "No," I told her softly. "I'm just setting something right." We stood together for a moment in silence before she hugged me tightly. I hadn't expected it, but I welcomed it. When I stepped back outside, the autumn air hit my face crisp and alive. The street bustled with ordinary sounds, a delivery truck unloading boxes, a man sweeping the sidewalk, children chasing each other near the corner store. I paused at the top of the shelter steps and let the sun warm my skin. For years, I had poured myself into people who laughed at my existence, who treated my presence as an inconvenience. Today, I had poured myself into something that mattered, something that would stand long after the insults faded. The money I gave away was no longer just numbers on paper. It had become beds, meals, medicine safety. It had become justice. I walked to my car with steady steps, shoulders back, head high. As I opened the door, I turned once more toward the mural on the shelter wall, the painted flowers stretching toward the sky. They seemed brighter than before. For the first time in a long while, I did not feel erased. I felt seen. I felt necessary. And as I drove away, I realized that what I had given away had finally returned to me in a new-form dignity. The apartment smelled of fresh paint when I carried the last box inside. The place was smaller than the house I had left behind, but the light from the south-facing windows made it feel open in a way no wide room ever had. Teresa Lopez, the manager, had left a welcome basket on the counter with coffee crackers and a tiny succulent in a ceramic pot. I touched the leaves and smiled. Something green for the windowsill. I unpacked slowly over the first few days, setting each item in its place with deliberate care. The basil plant went on the kitchen sill where it leaned toward the sun almost instantly. On the living room wall, I hung rubies drawing the chessboard sketched in sharp pencil lines, the woman with only 2 pieces still winning. Each time I passed it, I felt the echo of her voice saying she wanted me to keep it. When the shelves were stocked and the kettle was in its new home, I invited Marcia, Ida, and Nora over for tea. The 3 of them shuffled in with coats draped over their arms and voices raised in cheerful complaint about the stairs. Marcia, with her short gray hair and quick humor, carried a tin of lemon cookies. Ida, walking with her cane, brought a bundle of crossword puzzles. Nora, still smelling of the lavender perfume she had worn since the 60s, insisted she had nothing to contribute but her company. We settled at the small round table I had picked up at a thrift store. I poured tea into mismatched cups, blue porcelain mixed with plain white diner mugs, and the steam filled the room. Conversations started with small things, but soon each woman peeled back a layer. Marcia tapped her cookie against the saucer. My daughter hasn't called in months. She only reaches out when she needs something. Last week it was money for her electric bill. I sent it. She never said thank you. Ida sighed, twisting the handle of her cane. I keep worrying about what happens if I fall again. My nephew came once when I broke my hip, but he said he couldn't keep taking off work. The silence at night feels heavier than it used to. Nora's eyes watered as she looked into her tea. I lost my son in a car accident 20 years ago. Some days it feels like yesterday. The world kept moving, but I stayed frozen in that one phone call. The room grew quiet. I felt their words in my bones, echoes of my own disappointments and losses. But then Ruby burst through the door, cheeks flushed, carrying a plastic container. "Sorry I'm late," she said, setting it down. "I made chocolate chip cookies. They're a little burned, but if you close your eyes, they taste fine." Her grin lit the room, scattering the heaviness. She pulled a chair close to me and began telling a story about a teacher who wore socks that didn't match for a whole week. The laughter bubbled out of us, unsteady at first, then rolling. Even Nora laughed until tears ran down her cheeks. As the afternoon stretched, we shared slices of cake and bits of ourselves, grief and joy mixed together like sugar and salt. Ruby leaned against my shoulder at one point, her hair smelling faintly of shampoo, and I felt a warmth that went deeper than the tea in my cup. When the last of the cups were washed and the women had gone, I sat at my desk with the journal open. The page waited blank but expectant. I wrote slowly each word, carrying the weight of years. Today I did not wait for anyone to remember me. I chose myself. The words settled on the page, quiet but firm, like a key turning in a lock. I closed the book gently and placed it beside Ruby's drawing. The apartment was silent, but it did not feel empty. It felt like the beginning of something that was finally mine. A year later, the basil on my windowsill had grown thick and green, filling the air with its sweet scent whenever I brushed against it. I was 73 now, and the apartment had become more than a place to live. It was a sanctuary, each corner shaped by my own hands, each wall carrying only the weight I chose to give it. The days moved with a rhythm I had come to love. Quiet mornings with coffee and the paper afternoons filled with walks to the park or small visits from friends, evenings wrapped in the comfort of routine. One afternoon in early spring, I opened the mailbox downstairs and found an envelope with Daniel's handwriting. My stomach tightened, the familiar pull of old wounds. I carried it upstairs, sat at the table, and turned it over in my hands. The paper was thick, the ink pressed deeply into the name. I knew what it was before I opened it. An apology, a plea, perhaps both. I placed it in the drawer of my desk without breaking the seal. It was not anger that kept me from reading, but clarity. I no longer needed his words to define or soothe me. Leaving the letter untouched felt like an answer all its own. The following week, Ruby arrived with a rolled canvas under her arm. She had grown taller in that year, her voice carrying more certainty, though her eyes still held the same spark that reminded me of Daniel as a boy. She unwrapped the paper and revealed a painting, soft strokes of blue and gray, 2 chairs on a balcony. One was empty, the other cradled a cup of tea. I hung it by the sliding door that opened to my own balcony. The light fell across it in the late afternoon, making the colors glow. Ruby stood beside me and said, "Grandma, that chair will always be waiting for me." I pressed her hand and nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Later that month, Marcia, Ida, and Nora came over for tea again. They settled into my small living room, voices rising and overlapping laughter spilling through the windows. Marcia teased Ida about her endless crossword puzzles. Nora shared a story about a kind stranger who had carried her groceries when her arms trembled. Ruby joined us midway, her cookies underbaked as usual, and we all agreed they were perfect anyway. The apartment filled with sound, not the strained chatter of obligation, but the warm hum of people choosing to be together. I sat back in my chair and let it wash over me, the laughter, the clink of teacups, the shuffle of feet across the floor. The walls that once seemed bare now pulsed with life. When the evening grew late and the guests had gone, I tidied the table, rinsed the cups, and stood before the mirror in the hallway. The woman who looked back at me was not the same one who had once carried peach cobbler into a backyard where no one wanted her. My shoulders were straighter, my eyes clearer. I touched the glass lightly, a smile tugging at my lips. One insult made me rewrite my will and my life, and I do not regret it. Thank you for sharing this journey with me. If my story spoke to something in your heart, stay with me here, where voices like mine will keep finding their strength. Your presence makes the telling worthwhile.